All right. Welcome everyone to UCLA's or ACM Design at UCLA's workshop on interaction design. So again, I'm Crystal. I am here on behalf of ACM at UCLA, and I'm also joined by one of my officers, Chinmaya, who will be presenting alongside me. So
hello, everybody.
Yeah,
nice to meet you.
I'll hand it off to him to start.
Okay, well, first off, it's wonderful to meet you. My name is Chinmaya. I am one of the design officers at ACM Design at UCLA. I actually direct workshops with them during school year. And yeah, let's get started with this workshop. So we're looking at a collage of images right now, but what's the one element we really see in common here? And there aren't a lot of common elements, if you notice. Like there a lot of these, the single common element is that there's some interplay or some sort of interfacing going on between a person or a human being and some interactable system. So but the actual modality or the actual kind of that interaction, I guess in this case, all of these images represent touch, but they don't necessarily have to. In fact, I think there's one in the upper left that's actually meant to represent voice a little bit more than touch. But a lot of these are taking on different modalities, different methods of interaction. It could be through touchscreen, through switch, through light itself, through essentially through like buttons, or through whether those buttons are physical or digital, through like neomorphic, skeuomorphic interfaces. Like there's a number of different interaction possibilities here. So this is kind of helping us understand why interaction design is important to begin with, because there's so, in a world of infinite interactions, how do we know which ones we pick in order to get the best ones? Crystal, next slide, please.
Is it freezing? There we go. Cool.
Okay, there you go. So yeah, what exactly is interaction design? Is basically what it sounds like. It's the design of the interaction between users, or the humans using the product, and the products themselves, which are usually intelligent systems or interactable interfaces that are made to address the needs of a user. Next slide. So the single goal of interaction design is to create a product that enables the user to achieve whatever objectives they may have in the best way possible. And this best way could look different based on what the product is. So we all have a little bit of a bias towards the best way possible being intuitive, quick, and very seamless. But there are also some situations where it seems, or like some friction needs to be there if you're doing something very intensive. For example, if you're working with a financial transaction in any way, having those stopgap measures and creating a sense of friction there might actually serve your users better, because they're more cognizant of what they're doing at every stage of the process. But of course, all of these goals are determined by the context in which the user is actually using your product. But we're trying to help them bridge the gap between what they want to do and where they're at right now in the best way possible for the context. Next slide. Okay, so how does interaction design relate to UI and UX, which is kind of the theme of this conference? So we can model UI and UX as being two sides of the same coin, in the sense that if there is an interaction going on between a system, or like a screen, and a human being, the user, we can say that UI is what's happening on the screen. So that is contained within the system, and that exists regardless of the user or not. But the user experience is predicates itself on a user being there, and it's much more on the human side of that interaction. And interaction design basically occupies the middle of that Venn diagram, because it takes considerations from user experience, where humans need to actually interact with the product, and how are they doing so in the most intuitive and most fitting way, appropriate way possible. But it's also the modality it's using is the user interface. So it kind of occupies that middle ground, and we can think of it as sort of a marriage of these two concepts that we see often hyphenated so much. But yeah, next slide, please. So we can model these, and we can model interaction design as a whole using 5 dimensions of interaction design that we're leveraging in order to create that bridge between the user and their goals. The first dimension is words, and words are essentially just the literal messaging that we're using. That could be through text messages or like through like notifications that appear on the screen, or help copy, or even like voice text, or like speech to text or text to speech, or even speech itself through like virtual assistants like Google Assistant or Siri or Alexa. We can move on, we can layer on top of this with the second dimension, which is visual representations. And this is what we can, and this is essentially what you're all thinking. It's just the visual elements that you might see inside that interaction. Most of us know this as like all the visual elements, all the buttons and dials and knobs, and all the organizational structures that we see on a screen or like a visible UI. But it could also be the ways that we also could be how we interact with something physical through its buttons and where those buttons are placed, the visual representations and how they map to our actual interactions with them. Then moving on from that, there is also the third dimension, which we define as physical objects or space. And this is more on the user side, because that determines that physical objects that are involved in interacting with this product. Now, this could be through the modalities themselves, like what objects are the users using in order to interact with it? Are they using a laptop with a trackpad, or are they using a mouse itself, like a physical big mouse? Or are they just using their own fingers, using a touchscreen? Are they using their voice perhaps? Like what physical objects are involved in this interaction, and how is this interaction leveraging them in order to create something simple, yet something effective? And the fourth dimension is time. And this is this is usually meant for media that ends up changing with time. Okay, so that this could be animations, this could be this could be video, but this is meant for things that end up like utilizing time in order to change. And the fifth dimension is behavior, and that's more on the user side of this almost wraps up all the 4 previous dimensions into what this entire interaction design affords the user and how they can interact with the product. Or how does that manifest in their behavior, and how are we leveraging those manifestations? So these are the 5 dimensions that we're kind of taking into account. So yeah, Crystal, we can move on.
All right, so thanks, Chinmaya, for all those explanations. So I'll just dive deeper into examples, since I know that was kind of like a lot thrown at once. So with text, right? Text is used to communicate information to users, but not so much that they become overwhelmed. So let's say you are, scrolling through TikTok or whatnot on your phone, and then a notification pops up saying that, hey, a software update is available. Would you like to install now? Because, we get those at the wrong times, at the worst times possible, all the time, right? So you have 2 options. It can be yes or no. And if it does say yes or no, well, that does give a bit of context in terms of what the notification wants you to do, or giving you the 2 options, but it can be really vague, right? So what happens if you're, on an application or something, and there was also a yes or no question, your mind is kind of preset to the previous question, and you might misclick. Or maybe what if yes responds to like, yes, I want to install the app, or yes, I want to wait later to install the app, right? It's not necessarily clear. Okay, so like, how do we change this? Maybe saying no, ask me later, versus yes, install the app, install the update now. Okay, well, that's slightly better, but it's a bit too wordy, right? How many of you are spending more than a couple seconds reading a button or clicking it, right? I don't think any of us are. I don't think anyone wants to take the extra time to read buttons. Okay, so let's find the middle ground. The just right kind of notation would be maybe ask later versus install update. So still short and sweet, but it lets the users recognize the actual actions that each option wants you to click on, and you can proceed from there, right? So you might be thinking, what's an extra like 2-3 words that people are reading, right? It doesn't take that much effort. Well, yes, but you still, as an interaction designer, want to make their experience with the feature or the action or whatever it is as seamless as possible. You want them to recognize and act rather than stopping to think. The second dimension, as Chinmaya mentioned, is visual representations. So we're talking about colors, icons, graphics, anything that's universally recognized. So for example, with say like street signs and lights, we all know red means stop, green means go. In this case, right, with the music playlist, skip versus shuffle versus play, all those icons are relatively the same across the board. Yes, you can change the styling a little bit if you want to be creative, but for the most part, you're not seeing them change in any major way, right? So whatever application you're using, if it's a music app versus YouTube versus Netflix or whatever, you're going to see relatively the same icons all around. So again, recognize and act rather than stopping to think about what does this icon do or what happens when I push this button. You don't want your users to think that. Right. The third dimension is a bit more complicated, as Chinmaya talked about. It talks about physical objects or space. So in this case, right, you have a bunch of different, devices. You have your watch, your laptop, and your phone. All these, although you might be using the same applications and the same services on all three devices, the way you're using them and the way you're interacting with the product or service is going to vary, just because you're using a different device, you're using a different screen, and the way like you're physically interacting is going to be different. It makes common sense, or it does make sense when you think about it, but oftentimes a lot of designers, especially when you're starting out, you might forget this as you're designing for different screens as well. So to break this down, physical objects, you see here, this is kind of where responsive design comes in. Obviously, for each type of screen, you see a slightly different UI just based on the screen size. And obviously that will translate into you having to interact in a slightly different manner for each screen, right? So for example, on a phone, you're scrolling through Instagram. Like on your finger, you might be scrolling, right? But how many of us, even with like a touchscreen monitor, how many of you are actually scrolling? You're using your hand to scroll. Most of us are using a mouse or a mouse pad or maybe your arrow keys, right? So same action there, but slightly different like physical interaction. And in this case, right, in terms of like UI interactions, you're going to be clicking in different places just because the screen sizes are different. And the way that you're seeing like the responsive design and you're seeing the UI for a certain screen, layout is different. So obviously you're going to be interacting in a different way, in a different manner. So in terms of space, right? So let's take the action of looking up directions to go somewhere, right? 3 different scenarios for the same simple task of looking up directions using, say, like Apple Maps or Google Maps or whatever. First scenario, you might be driving, right? Obviously, you're not going to be touching your phone. At least I hope not. Please drive safe, everyone. But think about it, right? You might be pre-entering the directions before you drive. And as you're driving, most people need the audio feedback in terms of listening to like which way to turn. You're glancing up and down from the road to the screen, and you need the UI to reflect that so you can just take a quick look and be safe while driving. So that's one scenario. Maybe you're taking public transportation or you're walking, right? Most people, I don't think, are playing the directions as they're walking. They're just typing it in, looking up and down between their phone and like making sure they're on the right street. So slightly different interaction there, but you're still having the same UI changes to make sure that you're walking in the same direction, but you're no longer really requiring the audio component. Or maybe third scenario, you're one of those people who likes to be overly prepared and you want to search up the directions beforehand so you can memorize them and know which way you're going, right? I don't know how many of us do that, but maybe you're that type of person. So in this scenario, you might be at your home office or your work office on a desktop, and you're searching up the directions beforehand, like an hour before you have to head out. And so again, 3 different scenarios of searching up directions, but very like in each of the 3 scenarios, you're doing it in a very different way. So depending on the interaction depends on the scenario and the environment in which you are engaging with the product and application, right? So again, like Chinmaya says, this is just 3 of the many different like scenarios where you would be searching up directions on a map. But it's our job as designers to figure out, okay, how can we optimize the interactions for our users based on all these different scenarios? So that is just something to think about as you're designing. All right, the 4th dimension is time. So this takes all the previous dimensions and kind of just relays them back to the user just to make sure that, they understand, all the data that's being thrown back at them. They can match their progress. So you're talking about things like health apps, maybe diet apps, exercising tracking apps, and even things like music and video playlists. So a couple design details that enhance the user's experience, right? So let's talk about music. The tiny animation with like I guess like the volume bars, I don't know what it's called, but the one where it's like 3 bars, they move up and down, right? It's a cute little animation, but it serves to tell you as the user that your music is playing right now, right? So that's one way that a tiny little minuscule detail relays information and it changes over time. Another is like the timestamp, whether that's ascending through the song or descending, whatever the case, it's telling you as the user that your song is playing and you have X amount of time left for the song. And not only that, you also have, the bar that goes across the screen that tells you, like at what point of the song you're at or how much time left you have. Again, those are changes in time. Your UI will update just to tell you in real time, like all that information as well. And so just an example of how animation, video, sound within the time dimension can help you as a user, better your experience. And then behavior. So this dimension was kind of added on later after the first 4 were developed. And again, like Chinmaya said, they take the last 4 dimensions and kind of overwrap them or overarch them into one being behavior. So this is how the previous dimensions define the interaction of the product. So kind of more so relaying information back. So a common example is like Google search, right? Here, so like a reaction. What if you are trying to find something, I guess like in this case would be like some sort of like channel name and you find it, right? So one pop-up says like, hooray, like you found it, subscribe to this channel. And it lets you know that like this channel like exists, you can find it, you can subscribe it and interact with it. Or maybe you had a typo or whatnot and the next pop-up appears saying like, oh, sorry, I couldn't find anything in terms of like what you search for. Well, it's helpful for you as a user, telling you that maybe you made a typo, or maybe that this channel was taken down and you just found it afterwards, unfortunately. But either way, it's relaying information to you, telling you that it could not be found, right? So two different, or this is one scenario in which case like you're interacting with a product and the product is feeding you back information, telling you like maybe the next steps to take, or maybe like a way to like go back, retrace your steps and correct like your actions that you took. All right, and with that, I will pass it off to Chinmaya again for auditing.
All right, thanks a lot for the baton, Crystal. So we've answered a lot of, we sort of elaborated a lot on how we're modeling interaction design as a whole, and all the dimensions that we map on top of each other in order to figure out how we're actually building these interactions. But what about when the interactions are already built and we have to ask questions on how to make them better? Now that's where auditing interaction design comes in, and it forces us to ask us to ask the meta question of what questions are we asking about how our interactions work. Chris, next slide, please. All right, so one question that we can talk about is how will users interact with the interface? And this kind of plays with this idea of physical objects and behavior, like both those dimensions that we were talking about before. First off, what is the method of interaction? We could have a mouse interaction, we could have a touchscreen interaction. A stylus might be used if you were if you needed a little bit more precision. For example, if you were making art on Procreate. A trackpad or a keyboard, which most laptops are retrofitted with it anyway. A voice interaction, which has become increasingly popular as of late. And a wheel interaction, which conversely has kind of died down, but it's always a nice throwback from like the days where we had iPods that they did not have touchscreens. But like, yeah, I mean, all of these afford different methods of interaction and different mental models that may or may not fit the interface that you're actually making. If you were using an iPod, for example, with its wheel interface, the idea of scrolling circularly might map very well with navigating through sideways menus, as we were doing when we were using the iPod Touch. We were navigating through an entire sort of like album or folder system where we kind of where we scrolled clockwise, I think. Yeah, clockwise to go down and counterclockwise to go up. And we could just select, or we could skip, go behind, go to a menu, or play or pause. It was very simple. It was one of the simpler systems that we had available at the time, and it was quite intuitive. But that got replaced by things that were even more intuitive, like touchscreens, and like things that appealed to us a little bit more naturally as well, like being able to talk to a digital interface, which is a voice assistant, for example. But moving on from the method, even on top of that, what are the action possibilities that we have when we even have these like modalities to interact with? We could have maybe text commands like on a console. We could have a drag and drop system, which is pretty common with like the desktop metaphor. We have button presses, which is common for anything with buttons. Like I think we've all used stuff with buttons. We have swiping, which is like quite common for like touchscreens. Natural language, which is more of a voice thing, or it could be more. It could also be pretty prominent within chatbots that are kind of an increasing technology now, an increasingly common mode of interaction. And we can even go as far as gesture recognition through VR, or through like the old Xbox Ones that had the camera retrofitted with the Xbox, and it detected all of your movements and your motions in order to facilitate gameplay. Now we have VR where VR goggles like Oculus, where we can use those gesture recognitions for a lot more dynamic tasks. But we have to consider all these action possibilities and which one might be the most appropriate for a situation when we're asking questions about these interactions. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so next question we might ask are, what clues are we giving the users about functionality through the interactions that we're affording them? For example, I think we have like a couple of examples laid out here. In the leftmost image, we have a number of visual elements we're seeing on a simple login window, but a lot of visual markers in these elements are letting us know how we can interact with them. Why do we know that the login heading isn't text input, but the email entry or the password entry is? And what is the iconography representing here? There's one icon that seems to just be decorative or seems to be a visual draw. But if we look at the password field, we can see that there's another icon, which is an X, that actually seems to be interactable. But how do we know the difference, and how are we demarcating that difference? How are we using size, color, text cues to signal things about functionality and priority? The fact that the login button is so much more boldly colored than the text inputs. Why is that? Because the login button is just something that's meant to be pressed and not necessarily changed in itself, whereas lighter color associated with a text entry associates it with a little bit easier of a time when you're trying to edit it, or you're trying to change it in some form, which is what we're doing when we're trying to input text. If we're looking at the rightmost screen, we're looking at a meaningful text signal as well. We have the heading similar to how we had in the login, but there's also a text paragraph that's giving us additional context about what we're using. See all the new features we've added to our tutorial. We even have two different buttons here that are all different senses of priority, which is clearly trying to nudge the user towards seeing the tutorial, but still giving me the option to skip it for now. So in this way, we can consider the appearance of our visual elements and how that appearance affects the information we're actually giving the user about their action. Next slide, please. Thank you. And on top of that, we can, when we're giving them clues about functionality, we can also think about what happens when that functionality goes wrong, or when that functionality is misunderstood. So how are we going to anticipate, and how are we going to mitigate errors? Now, there's a lot of like do's and don'ts when it comes to error mitigation. One of the biggest do's is trying to tell you what the issue is and how to fix it very clearly and very compactly. We can see this in the above example, where it highlights the specific thing that has gone wrong and highlights exactly how it's gone wrong. if there was a fictional city that somebody's entered or a city that the system doesn't recognize, it will say that specifically, and it can help the user diagnose what the issue is and course correct from there. But the second example makes you play a guessing game. It just tells you an error has occurred, and it's up to you to figure out what exactly the error is. Is it like the city is invalid? Like it makes you play a guessing game, and nobody likes to be prompted to have to think about, oh my God, what am I doing or what has gone wrong? People want to be sort of eased through that process. Are your error states informative, or are they correctly informative as well? Like you also don't want to dole out too much information when there's an error. Like if say there was a city and the city is unknown, you don't want to go in, like represent the backend for them and be like, okay, in this structure specifically, we're not finding any matches within this array, because nobody wants to go into that level of detail if they're a casual user. So we want to like make sure that they are informative, but also the correct level of informative. And we also might want to think about mitigation, which are constraints that might help users make less errors in the future. How are we instituting guardrails that will guide interactions so users feel less prompted to break that system and to do things that are outside of our intended use case? So yeah, next slide, please. Thanks, Crystal. Okay, so I'm not sure how well this is coming out, because I know that we're over Zoom and like Zoom can be really laggy. Hopefully it's coming out well enough for you. So this is a concept for interaction that Uber released for their Jump app when they were exploring their scooter offering, or a lot like Birds or Limes. So like I think Uber bought out Lime, so they're working with Lime now. But this was an interaction design concept for a potential Jump app, which after this they ended up just incorporating it within the regular Uber app. But I wanted to sort of use this to highlight or have you observe what feedback the user's getting when they actually take an action. Let's think about things like loading space. It introduces with a splash screen that's very visually appealing. We also know that means that we're being introduced to the app. There's a loading state as we're trying to unlock the actual app itself. When jumps are popping up, we can see that there are different jumps popping up in different places. Is there a success message that happens after we try to unlock an actual jump app? How are the animations actually serving us, and what are they messaging to us, and how are they giving us that feeling of progress, or whether something's already been completed? It's also conveying information about state. So we want to think about feedback very actively in this situation. Next slide, please. The next one is one of the most important things that we need to consider, which is, are the elements designed and built to be usable? And if we're working in UI and UX, usability is kind of our key thing. Like we cannot have anything without usability. Usability is literally our job. But so we can think about two different dimensions here. There are so many dimensions to what goes into usability, but two dimensions I'd like to talk about are sizing and placement. So first off, sizing. Which button out here do you think is the easiest to interact with? I'd say you probably say the largest one, because it offers the most surface area for you to be able to tap on or to be able to click on. And this is especially important for touch interactions, where you might have, like, if you're like me, you have these sausage fingers that like cover a lot of surface area every time that you're tapping the screen. So having a large enough text element means that we have to have less precision. Sorry, not text element, a button or a large enough interactable element means that we have to have less precision when we're actually interacting with the interface. But of course, there will be a trade-off between accessibility and clean visual design there, because the larger you make every single element, the more they might compete with each other, or the more space they might occupy. So you'll have less negative space and less breathing room inside the design itself. So it's going to be a trade-off that you want to consciously make, where you want to preserve the visual design, but you also want to make things interactable. And it's up to us to find that sweet spot when we're considering sizing. We can also consider placement, which is mainly optimized for touch interaction, but it can also be optimized for like when we're interacting with our laptops. And like, how many of you have gone onto? I feel like I've gone onto a website where I've had to interact with two different things, two different parts of the screen in quick succession, but they've been like located in opposite corners of the screen, which means that I have to go from one corner and then scroll all the way up, or go to the other corner, and then move my cursor all the way back down, go to the other corner, and then keep on having to sort of play this game of whack-a-mole when it comes to my interactions. And that almost tires my fingers out. Like, as lazy as this sounds, like the less finger movement that we have to do for similar interactions, the better. And this is especially true for touch interactions, where when we're normally interacting with a phone, we're usually holding it with 4 fingers, and maybe we're we're actually tapping with our thumb, or perhaps we're holding it with one hand and using our index finger to tap on the screen. I usually use my phone where I'm like holding it with one hand and using my thumb to interact with it. And that means that it requires a stretch when I have to get to certain parts of the screen versus others. Fitts law is important for both of these, because Fitts law essentially designates that the most important elements on the screen or on whatever interactable surface you're using need to be the easiest to get to, because the greater distance or the greater friction that you're adding, the less usable those elements become. So this is really highlighted in the power off screen that most iPhones have, where cancel is usually the easiest thing to tap onto. And we make sure that if the user really wants to power something off and they're not just doing so on autopilot, they have to make that extra reach or that extra stretch in order to slide to power it off. So that extra piece of effort conveys intentionality, whereas like a button on the bottom of the screen could be done by autopilot. I think there was a comment on one of the chats where where somebody was talking about pressing a lot of buttons on autopilot without actually reading the feedback on the screen. And Fitts law, it can be leveraged in order to actually avoid these situations. And I think the iPhone closing screen actually leveraged that pretty well. So next slide, please, Crystal. Thank you so much. So this is more of an offshoot from the previous from the previous slide, and this is more for my devs in the audience. But within Google Chrome DevTools, there is a tool called Lighthouse that can literally help you with accessible sizing. And it essentially runs a number of tests on a website and determines what aspects of it are usable and what aspects aren't from a web development perspective. For example, within the screen, we can see that there are numbers of like tap targets that aren't necessarily sized appropriately or aren't clickable, aren't necessarily clickable enough according to Google like interaction guidelines. So we can use the tools, a lot of tools like these in order to help us audit whether we're going accessible enough. And like it can also help us assess the trade-offs we're making and if we're making too much of a trade-off in favor of one thing at the expense of another. When I was talking about the trade-off between clean visual design and accessible sizing, this is what I'm talking. This can help you assess where that trade-off can lie. So this may not be super relevant to you if you don't really do web development, but I feel like everybody could use a little bit more thinking about the tools that are available to them in order to help them do this. But yeah, next slide, Crystal. So one of the last questions I'll ask is, are you using familiar formats for your users? So to illustrate this, I'd like to compare the Walkman, which I don't know if any of us, I don't know if many of us are actually old enough to have ever had a Walkman, because I feel like when I was growing up, I grew up with an iPod Touch. I never really had a Walkman, but I know what it is. But you can notice that there are a lot of familiar symbols between a Walkman to the Spotify players that we're all used to now. So, for example, you can see the play or off button here, which can map to a play button inside Spotify. The fast forward and rewinds also map to, and we're using the same symbol and the same sort of imagery within the actual digital interface, even though we don't necessarily have to. It's still using a common language almost, because when you're using a lot of these interactable elements, you're almost speaking a language to the user, and you don't want to switch up the language if they're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to preserve as much of their initial context as possible, because part of this is the 80-20 rule, where we're modeling that users will spend at least 80% of their time using products within the same space that aren't ours, which is why the formats that industry guidelines specify or the formats that have been historically used by users can't really go ignored. We have to pay attention to them. And if we are breaking the format a little bit, we have to do so consciously, intentionally, and with knowledge of the risks that may come with it. And we have to make sure that our reasoning for doing so justifies the change that we're making. But wherever possible, it's generally a good rule of thumb to use the formats that everybody else is used to already. Or if you are iterating on them, make small iterations that don't necessarily change the actual language that they're using, but maybe streamlines it a little bit or adds a little bit of personality to the interaction. Next slide, please.
Whoop.
Oops.
There we go. Okay.
The users. Yeah.
Sad.
Whoa, what's going on? Oh
Okay.
my God.
Don't think or technical difficulties on our end. Sorry. I hope it's okay. Staying cool. All right. Okay, so Chinmaya, Crystal, those were a lot of great points, but is there like a list I can refer to where like it condenses all that information so I don't have to remember it all, or I don't have to like, take notes or whatnot? Well, guess what? There is, and it's called Jacob's 10 usability heuristics. If you're in the design world, you'll probably have heard of this like sometime in your career or as like you're in your development, but essentially what these are these are like 10 kind of broad guidelines to help you with your design. They're not necessarily like I have to strictly follow this to make sure that my design is good, because they're not specific at all. These are just meant to guide your designs and make sure that you're keeping the right factors and the right features in mind while you're designing a certain feature or a screen or whatnot. So I won't go over all of them, but a couple to highlight are things like flexibility, right? So if I'm like trying to search up this conference event, I might type up SJSU Design Conference, whereas Chinmaya might have the actual like website link to input, or Katie, since she knows the actual like title of the event, might type in UX UI Collegiate Conference, right? So three different inputs, three different ways of getting to the same event, but the main idea is that whatever interaction you do or whatever feature you kind of like are working on, there should be multiple routes to get to that destination, and it should be very clear in terms of how you're getting there. So if I click the back button, it should not take me. I should not be going the route that Chinmaya took or Katie took. I should be going back on the route that I took. So again, if you're using say like breadcrumb navigation, please make sure that your routes are documented in the manner that the user took to get to that destination. Just because we are all going to the same destination or doing the same action doesn't mean that like they should be documented the same. Like I did not type in the website to this design conference. I did not type UX UI Collegiate Conference. I typed in SJSU Design Conference. So just keep that in mind. Another thing is making sure that your design is consistent. So say if I'm like, shopping online and I'm adding things to my cart, and then it's one of the payment options is Venmo, right? A pop-up comes up and I can see that, okay, this window has very different branding. It's very blue. It shows me that, oh, hey, I'm using Venmo now. So in this case, for consistency, like you want to make sure that your users understand whether or not they're working in the same space or not. And in my example, right, I open up a pop-up to pay with Venmo. It's very clear to me with the branding that Venmo has compared to like say a store's website that I am in a different space right now. I'm no longer on the website, the shop's website. I'm now using a different service, and it's telling me mentally as a user that you are in a different space now. Actions might be a little bit different. Your interactions might be different. And if you return back, you can go back to, casually shopping or browsing, right? So having like, if that pop-up was in the same branding as the shop's website, I might think, oh, this is probably an in-house application that the shop is using, and I'm in the same space, right? So think of, especially with branding and UI designs, whether or not you are communicating to your users that whether or not they're working in the same space or not. Another, like Chinmaya mentioned, are error messages and guidelines. I'm sure you all have filed forms online before and have definitely inputted maybe your phone number or the dates in different formats, right? How do I know as a user that the form wants me to input today's date as 10/30/21 versus 10/30/2021 versus October 31, 2021, right? If the error message just tells me that, hey, you entered the date in an invalid format, that doesn't help me. There's just so many ways to enter a date or enter a phone number. How am I supposed to know, right? So a couple ways to mitigate that are one with the error message telling me as a user, hey, like can you please enter your phone number or your date in this particular format? Or have that format like pre-entered in the text box in gray. So sometimes you'll see like, oh, please enter date in mm/dd/yy format. Or maybe just have it auto format. So however you type, it'll just fix it for the users. So just a couple things of these 10 heuristics to keep in mind as you're designing. All right, and that is it for our interaction design workshop. Any questions from the audience? Anything that you need us to clarify or elaborate on? We'll give it a couple minutes.
We're here, so take your time, think about the question. Like, there's no rush.
I have a question. You guys were so well informed on this and spoke about it really well. I was just curious, where did you like learn all of this? Like, was this part of like something you learned in school or outside of school?
Yeah, Chinmaya, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll handle this. But yeah, so for me personally, technically I'm learning about it in school right now because I'm taking my first UX workshops in my first UX classes in my senior year. But like before that, I kind of bootstrapped a lot of this info, and like I was just researching. I did a lot of like work, a lot of online courses, a lot of like scouring the internet for resources, YouTube, like I literally scrapped a lot of this knowledge together, and basically it was a little tough for me when I was starting out because like the UX is a relatively young field, right? And like it's if you don't have that structure, it can be a little bit hard to find a footing, and structure isn't super like centralized. So, but for me, like it did help in the sense that I could sort of mold how I wanted my UX education to be. And I could sort of take it bit by bit, step by step. So like I basically just scoured the internet. That was basically my strategy. But yeah, I mean, I ended up filling in the gaps with a little bit of formal education. Like I think boot camps are a great way to go if you like that structure. If you like being a little bit scrappy and a little bit on a budget, then YouTube honestly will help you. There's also a great website called the Interaction Design Foundation, which really helped me when I was starting out. It's super comprehensive. But yeah, like that's basically how I started out, and like I just use that to work on stuff and then learn by doing as well. So a lot of the stuff that like we're talking about is also stuff that we have learned by failing at and then learning from. So like there really, I don't think there's really any replacement for real on-hand work. But yeah, like I think Crystal can like handle that.
Yeah, and it's same.
Yeah.
It's like I like searched it up on my own. Unlike Chinmaya, I'm not taking any classes, going in this blind. And I think for me, the first time I heard about interaction design was when I was like searching up for internships and jobs, and I saw on Google there's like interaction designer. I'm like, oh, how is that different from like say UX UI design? And that's where I kind of fell in. But yeah, I understand it's very hard to figure out like or like try to search up something when you don't know what you're searching for or you don't know where to start. But yeah, all the resources Chinmaya mentioned should be helpful. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm sure at least on our end, we'll drop our LinkedIn's on Discord and as well as in chat. So if you have any other questions about interaction design, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you also want to check out ACM Design at UCLA as well, the socials are here. And for both UCLA ACM as a whole and also as for our committee as well. And feel free to check out our work.
Oh wait, I think we have a question in the chat as well.
Oh, what are your majors? Okay, yes. I'm an economics major, so very kind of far left field from the design world. But my minor is in something called digital humanities, which is kind of like looking at social issues and social causes through the lens of technology, which also does include design, which is pretty cool. And I would 100% do as a major if that was an option.
Yeah, same here. I'm also the same minor as Crystal. I'm also within that digital humanities minor, and but my major is cognitive science, so it's a little bit less left field. It leads into design pretty well because it thinks about the psychology of users and how they make decisions at a micro level. And I think that's how I kind of ended up getting into design from the behavioral side, which I know is relatively uncommon. But most people go in from a visual perspective. But yeah, I really like how my major and the thing I want to do line up very well.
All right, and with that, I'll stop the recording here. So thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you guys learned a thing or two about interaction design and how it differs. And I hope to see you guys, as aspiring designers out in the professional world very soon. And with that, I will stop the recording.